The style for Mulan looks very simple, but it was actually very hard to achieve. It took a lot of experimenting, a lot of searching to discover it.
There's a couple ways to do a style of the film. You can go find an artist that you want that movie to look like, and that's what the movie's going to look like. Kind of like Gustav Tengren on Pinocchio, or Tyrus Wong on Bambi, or even like Gerald Scarfe on Hercules. They have a style that you really go after, and that's what you're after right from the start. Or you can let a style progress and grow into a certain style. And that's what we did on Mulan. We let the movie find itself. So that's why it was tough in the beginning, because we were searching for a style.
You know, we struggled for a very long time. Remember, some of us were on the movie for 5 years. So at the very beginning, we really struggled with what the film was going to look like. We had a lot of talented people on helping us, but it just wasn't gelling. It wasn't magic.
We thought about, let's teach all the painters how to paint watercolor. So we stretched watercolor paper and got it all together, and we bought Chinese brushes and we learned inks, and it was very difficult to teach, a team of 30 artists how to do watercolor.
And then we went to a man who I believe is one of the most talented people we have here, by the name of Hans Bacher, and we asked him to come and work on the movie as our production designer. And Hans took his inherent style and studied the Chinese way of art and combined them.
We tried to include everything we can get from Chinese art history to the original locations into our film. It has to look Chinese.
Hans Bacher has had a background in theatrical design, but his approach always to his work is a very graphic, simple statements. And we thought that related very well to what was being done in the Tang Dynasty. More of a purist vision of form, composition, color. All aspects of the visual arts were almost boiled down to their essence. And that's what we were trying to find, is an essence of design that we could put together that wouldn't look like any other movie we had made. In fact, we worked very hard to make it look very unique, but styled enough to have a great stage for our characters.
We spent 3 weeks in China, traveled all over China, from one end of the Great Wall to the other, trying to get the flavor and the inspiration and the atmosphere of the film. And we decided to go with a nice design theory that everything was going to have inner strength and not get caught up in covering things with a lot of details.
So now that we actually found a style that we liked, the hardest thing was to get background painters and artists and layout artists to draw and paint that style in a very simplistic way.
The films that we had worked on before this were Hunchback and Lion King, and they're very detail-oriented for their believability, and we were kind of going the complete opposite direction of simplicity, and we always felt that we had to dial in more detail, and just because of where we've been.
And it was tough at first because a lot of artists like to render and add a lot of more detail, so it was tough to pull the reins on the artists and get them just to hold back a bit and study Chinese painting and not get too involved in doing a lot of detail.
And when going through that, all of a sudden I realized that a theme came up, and Hans brought it up, and it was a big shapes, small positive detail. And then I watched the movie. It's this big negative scenario. There's this war happening.
You just gave away our position! Now we're...
Mulan's thrown into the situation where her father might die. She knows he will die. He's hurt. He's not going to go back to war. She's the small positive detail, and the big situation is those big shapes. So I felt like background actually reflected that idea. So we had to come up with the least amount of brushwork to create a style, and because of that, layout was very important, that they didn't put in too much detail. They put in big shapes that worked.
And as we moved through sort of the visual development into the final look of the movie, it became very apparent that we had a really graphic look, a big use of negative, positive space, combined with the simplicity of Chinese art. And somewhere along the line, someone coined the phrase poetic simplicity. And it kind of resonated with everyone, and we used it as sort of our guidepost when we had to make design decisions.
One of the first things that we realized when we were creating Mulan was that this was no small film. It's built into the story that there's huge crowds. All of China comes to see her, be revered by the emperor. How are we going to do that?
We really didn't have enough time left in the production schedule to do crowds the way they had been done before in Disney Feature Animation. So what we did is we took some animation from an earlier sequence, this is the camp sequence, and we took some animation from that sequence and applied animation onto cards, if you will, kind of billboards. And so each of these cards had a character on it, and we would then figure out a way to populate a scene with a bunch of these cards that have these animations on them. We had a test where you take the camera and you fly it up straight up and see these things really are cards, but when you put the characters on those cards, it's entirely believable that they're fully rounded people and not, flat characters. An animator can paint an image that would determine where the crowds would go. A white area, that's where the characters are standing. And if they're painting a gray area, there would be less people standing in that area.
So now we had crowds that we could place anywhere, and they could do different kinds of behaviors, from clapping and cheering. It was exactly what we hoped for, and I couldn't have been more pleased with it. It looks great. So now that we had the great fullness that was achieved by the crowds, we thought, how can we create a move over that went with our 2D style still, but also gave it a little bit more of a fullness and richness to the film. And that's when Eric and his team created what we call the faux plane.
I kept thinking about how we might approach the palace in an enhanced dramatic way, as opposed to doing something that was fully 3D and something that was only 2D. How about something that's sort of 2.5D, somewhere in between? And I started thinking more and more about what had been developed in the 1930s, where they designed a huge camera crane called the multiplane camera. And the multiplane camera is a camera where you have a base which has a background on it, and several levels in which you can place artwork, and then you have a camera on top that looks down through all these levels of artwork down to the bottom background. You get a very dimensional feeling. So if you look at Pinocchio and you see Jiminy Cricket hopping towards Geppetto's house, you'll see the effect of a multiplane camera. There's a lot of depth, but it's still not really 3D, it's sort of 2D. So taking that idea of a multiplane camera, we came up with something that we call faux plane. And faux plane allowed us to take each of these levels of artwork that we have and sculpt the artwork. So it's like you're looking at each of these levels and you can literally push and pull on areas to create a little bit of dimension within these levels of artwork. And now as you push your camera through those levels of artwork, it really feels a lot more dimensional, but it still looks like artwork. So it's somewhere halfway in between the idea of something that's completely flat that you're moving a camera through and something that's entirely three-dimensional.
We felt like now we had a full, rich film, and it really made it big, and it made it emotional. It added just that touch to it, I think, that made it kind of that big blockbuster film that we wanted this to be.